40% of the stuff that you and I buy comes through the Panama Canal, and due to the drought that they're having over there, ships are waiting.
The Panama Canal, once a revolutionary shortcut between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, is now facing serious challenges from climate change-induced water shortages to growing inefficiency. American consumers could soon see higher prices on many of the things we buy due in part to major shipping delays over at the Panama Canal. As global trade struggles with delays and rising costs, alternative routes are emerging, each aiming to take its place. Among them, Mexico's Interoceanic Corridor has captured global attention, promising a faster, more sustainable solution. Join us as we discuss how Elon Musk revealed the terrifying truth behind Mexico's $4.5 billion Panama Canal rival. We cannot talk about what Elon Musk revealed about Mexico's Panama Canal rival until we understand why there would be any need for the Panama Canal to have a rival. The Panama Canal is one of the greatest engineering feats of all time, a shortcut that reshaped global trade and, let's be honest, an absolute lifesaver for ships that would otherwise have to brave the treacherous waters of South America. Before the canal, if a ship wanted to travel from New York to San Francisco, it had to take a grueling 13,000-mile journey around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, a place notorious for its unpredictable storms, icy winds, and waves as tall as buildings. The Panama Canal sliced through the narrowest part of the isthmus, turning that nightmare of a voyage into a relatively smooth 50-mile passage. What used to take months could now be completed in less than a day. The brilliance of the canal lies in its system of locks. Instead of digging a sea-level canal, which would have been nearly impossible due to the mountainous terrain and constant risk of landslides, engineers created a series of locks that lift ships up to a massive artificial lake and then lower them back down on the other side. The heart of the system is Gatun Lake, an artificial freshwater lake 85 feet above sea level. Ships coming from the Atlantic are lifted in 3 stages through the Gatun locks, sail across the lake, pass through the narrow Culebra Cut, where the canal slices through the Continental Divide, and then descend through another set of locks to reach the Pacific. The entire process takes about 11 hours, give or take, and uses around 52 million gallons of fresh water for every ship that passes through. The idea of a canal slicing through Panama isn't new. In fact, it dates all the way back to 1513 when the Spanish explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa became the first European to cross the Isthmus of Panama. He stood on the shores of the Pacific Ocean, gazed at the vast waters, and realized how much easier life would be if ships didn't have to travel thousands of miles around South America to get there. But like many great ideas, this one remained just that, a dream, for centuries. By the 16th century, Spain's Charles I even ordered a survey to explore the possibility of a canal, but technology at the time was nowhere near capable of handling such an ambitious project. Instead, the Spanish stuck to carrying cargo overland from one coast to the other, sweating under the brutal tropical sun. Fast forward a few hundred years, and interest in an interoceanic canal hadn't faded. The Scots tried their luck in 1698, launching the infamous Darien Scheme, an attempt to establish a colony and trade route across the isthmus. The plan was a complete disaster, with disease, starvation, and financial ruin wiping out the effort in just 2 years. Meanwhile, European powers kept eyeing Panama, seeing it as a golden opportunity just waiting to be seized, if only they could figure out how. By the 19th century, the world was rapidly modernizing, and the dream of a canal started feeling more realistic. The first real attempt came from none other than Ferdinand de Lesseps, the French mastermind behind the Suez Canal. Fresh off his success in Egypt, he was convinced he could pull off a similar feat in Panama. Spoiler alert, he couldn't. In 1881, the French began construction, but they massively underestimated the challenges of Panama's unforgiving terrain and disease-ridden climate. Unlike the flat, sandy lands of Egypt, Panama was a dense jungle filled with mountains, venomous creatures, and, worst of all, mosquitoes carrying deadly diseases like malaria and yellow fever. Workers were dying by the thousands, landslides were a constant problem, and the costs kept skyrocketing. By 1889, the French effort collapsed into one of the greatest engineering failures of all time. More than 22,000 workers died, and the project burned through $287 million, which was a mind-boggling amount back then. The whole thing was a scandal, ruining the reputations of many involved, including Gustave Eiffel. Yes, the same guy who built the Eiffel Tower. But just because the French failed didn't mean the idea was dead. Someone else was bound to step in, and that someone was the United States. By the early 1900s, the US was determined to build a canal, but the big debate was where. Some favored Nicaragua, which had a large lake that could be used for the passage, but Panama had the advantage of being much narrower. The final push toward Panama came thanks to a little trickery. Philippe Bonavarilla, a French engineer with a personal stake in the failed canal project, worked hard to convince the US that Nicaragua was too dangerous. He even sent fake photos of Nicaraguan volcanoes erupting to scare off American decision-makers. The trick worked, and in 1902, the US chose Panama. Now, there was just one small problem: Panama wasn't an independent country. It was still part of Colombia, and Colombia wasn't exactly eager to let the US take over part of its land. So, the US pulled off what can only be described as a textbook example of gunboat diplomacy. In 1903, with US backing, Panama declared independence, and within days, American warships blocked any attempt by Colombia to take back its territory. The US quickly signed a treaty with a newly independent Panama, securing the rights to build and operate the canal in perpetuity, something that, as you can imagine, didn't sit well with Panamanians in the long run. The Americans officially took over construction in 1904, inheriting a mess of abandoned French equipment and unfinished work. John Stevens, the chief engineer, was the first to realize that the key to success wasn't just in digging, it was in keeping the workers alive long enough to finish the job. Enter Dr. William Gorgas, a medical genius who led a groundbreaking mosquito control campaign. By draining swamps, fumigating buildings, and installing mosquito nets, he virtually wiped out yellow fever and drastically reduced malaria. With disease under control, the focus shifted to construction. Unlike the French, who had insisted on a sea-level canal, the Americans opted for a lock-based system. The plan was to dam the Chagres River, create the massive Gatun Lake, and use a series of locks to raise and lower ships. This solution was cheaper, faster, and far more practical. By 1907, George Washington Goethals took over as chief engineer, and the project went into high gear. Thousands of workers, many from the Caribbean, labored under grueling conditions, using steam shovels, dynamite, and sheer determination to carve through the mountains. One of the toughest challenges was the Culebra Cut, a section where constant landslides threatened to bury the workers alive. On October 10, 1913, President Woodrow Wilson pressed a telegraph button from the White House, triggering the final explosion that destroyed the last barrier of land. The Atlantic and Pacific were officially connected. The Panama Canal opened on August 15, 1914, with the SS Ancon making the first official transit. The project had cost the U.S. nearly $500 million, but it was worth it. Although this whole idea sounded incredible, fast forward to today, and the Panama Canal has more problems than ever before. Sure, it's still one of the most important trade routes in the world, allowing ships to bypass the long and dangerous journey around South America, but running this 110-year-old engineering marvel isn't as easy as it used to be. As the years passed, the cracks started to show, literally and figuratively. The first big problem was that the canal was getting too small for modern shipping. When it was originally built, it was designed to handle Panamax ships, vessels built to fit perfectly within the locks. But by the early 2000s, shipping companies were building bigger and bigger ships to carry more cargo in fewer trips. These Neo-Panamax giants were simply too large for the original canal. To keep up, Panama launched an ambitious expansion project in 2007. A third set of locks was built, allowing Neo-Panamax ships to finally pass through. This upgrade, completed in 2016, was supposed to be the canal's golden ticket to the future. However, bigger locks weren't the only issue. Water supply became a major problem. The Panama Canal relies on massive amounts of fresh water to operate. Each time a ship passes through the locks, about 52 million gallons of fresh water from Gatun Lake is lost to the ocean. The system was built assuming Panama would always have enough rain to refill the lake. Unfortunately, climate change had other plans. Panama has been experiencing longer and more severe droughts over the past few decades. In particularly dry years like 2015 to 2016, 2019, and 2023, the lake's water levels dropped dangerously low, forcing authorities to limit the number of ships passing through. By December 2023, the canal was operating at only 22 transits per day, compared to the usual 30 to 36. For shipping companies, this was a nightmare. The backlog of ships waiting to cross grew, delays piled up, and businesses had to pay higher fees to reserve slots. Some even had to reroute their cargo thousands of miles, looking for alternative trade routes. To make matters worse, deforestation and land degradation around the canal have also reduced the lake's water storage capacity. As trees disappear and erosion increases, the lake fills with sediment, making the problem even worse. Panama has tried to counter these issues by building water-saving basins in the new locks, recycling up to 60% of the water used. But with climate change intensifying, the long-term sustainability of the canal is still uncertain. If you think these water shortages are just a problem for Panama, think again. The entire world depends on this canal. With fewer ships able to pass through, global supply chains have been hit hard. Shipping costs have skyrocketed, and businesses that rely on predictable delivery schedules have faced delays and uncertainty. Even major shipping companies like Maersk have had to adjust. In early 2024, Maersk announced that they would use the Panama Canal Railway, a train system that runs across the isthmus, to transport containers instead of waiting for ships to pass through. It's a creative workaround, but it's also a sign that businesses are losing confidence in the canal's reliability. Unfortunately, all this has led to the creation of various rivals that offer a simpler, easier passage from one side of the bay to the other. The best of them is Mexico's Interoceanic Corridor of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. Unlike the massive locks and artificial lakes of the Panama Canal, this ambitious Mexican project takes a completely different approach, one that doesn't require billions of gallons of fresh water or decades of excavation through mountain ranges. Instead, it relies on something much simpler. An upgraded railway system, modernized ports, and a strategic location could make Mexico one of the most efficient trade routes in the world. At its core, the Interoceanic Corridor is Mexico's bold attempt to challenge Panama's century-old dominance in maritime trade. Positioned at the narrowest stretch of land in the country, just 192 miles from coast to coast, it offers a land-based alternative to the congested and increasingly unreliable Panama Canal. The idea isn't new. In fact, the dream of connecting the Pacific and Atlantic through this region dates back centuries, long before the Panama Canal even existed. Hernán Cortés himself saw the potential in the 16th century, but the first serious attempt came much later, during the presidency of Porfirio Díaz in the early 1900s. Back then, Mexico built a railway across the isthmus, hoping to create a thriving trade route. But just as it was beginning to gain momentum, the completion of the Panama Canal in 1914 rendered it nearly obsolete. For over 100 years, the railway sat largely underused, a forgotten relic of Mexico's lost ambitions. Now, with a renewed sense of urgency, the Interoceanic Corridor is coming back to life. Mexico's government is betting big on this project, modernizing its railway network, expanding its ports, and developing industrial parks along the route to attract global companies. The goal is to create a high-speed, high-efficiency trade corridor where cargo can be offloaded from ships on the Pacific coast, transported across the isthmus by train, and then reloaded onto vessels bound for the Atlantic, all in a fraction of the time it would take to pass through the Panama Canal. The timing couldn't be better. The Panama Canal is struggling with some of its worst challenges in history, from climate change-induced droughts to congestion and rising costs. With limited water resources, Panama has been forced to cut down the number of ships passing through each day, creating massive delays and forcing companies to look for alternative routes. That's where Mexico steps in. Unlike the canal, the Interoceanic Corridor doesn't rely on fresh water, which means it won't be affected by droughts in the same way. And because it doesn't use locks, it can handle shipments of all sizes without the draft restrictions that limit vessels in Panama. The grand reopening of the railway took place on December 22, 2023, when Mexico's president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, officially inaugurated what is now known as Line Z. This high-speed freight corridor stretches from Coatzacoalcos on the Atlantic side to Salina Cruz on the Pacific, integrating the latest transportation technology to maximize efficiency. The project is expected to handle up to 1 million containers annually, offering a much-needed alternative for global shippers looking to bypass the growing uncertainty of Panama's waterway. But as promising as it sounds, this project isn't without its challenges. For one, the region surrounding the corridor is home to many indigenous communities whose way of life could be disrupted by rapid industrialization. Environmentalists have also raised concerns about the impact of large-scale infrastructure development in one of Mexico's most biodiverse regions. Then there's the issue of security. The southern part of Mexico has long struggled with cartel violence, and ensuring that the corridor remains a safe and reliable trade route will be no small feat. Despite these concerns, Mexico is moving full speed ahead. The plan doesn't stop at just moving cargo. The government is also working to turn the corridor into a major industrial hub, attracting multinational corporations to set up manufacturing facilities in the newly created special economic zones along the route. With tax incentives and access to both oceans, these zones could bring thousands of jobs to one of Mexico's poorest regions while further strengthening the country's position in global trade. This project has already caught the attention of international investors, and even major shipping companies like Maersk have shown interest in using the corridor as an alternative to Panama. In fact, Mexico has gone so far as to establish a new maritime route between the port of Coatzacoalcos and Portugal's port of Sines, strengthening trade ties between Latin America and Europe. The corridor isn't just looking to rival the Panama Canal, it's positioning itself as a key player in a shifting global supply chain. The big question now is whether Mexico can pull it off. The Interoceanic Corridor offers undeniable advantages, but building trust with the global shipping industry will take time. Logistics companies need to be sure that the railway system can handle the demand, that security risks won't disrupt operations, and that Mexico's government remains committed to long-term maintenance and development. Meanwhile, Panama isn't going down without a fight. The Panama Canal Authority is already working on new solutions to improve water efficiency and maintain its status as the premier gateway between the oceans. Of course, no ambitious project comes without its fair share of challenges, and Mexico's Interoceanic Corridor is no exception. While the idea of creating a land-based alternative to the Panama Canal sounds great on paper, turning it into a reality will require overcoming some serious hurdles. From infrastructure gaps and energy shortages to security concerns and the skepticism of global shipping companies, Mexico is banking on this project revolutionizing global trade, but the road to success isn't exactly smooth. Can the country pull off what could be one of the most transformative infrastructure projects in its history? Or will this dream remain just that, a dream? The first major challenge the Interoceanic Corridor faces is infrastructure, or rather, the lack of it. While Mexico has taken significant steps to modernize the railway system and expand its ports, experts worry that the region still lacks the necessary highway capacity and industrial facilities to handle the level of trade required to compete with the Panama Canal. The corridor's success depends on moving cargo quickly and efficiently, but with the existing road network in the region still underdeveloped, logistics experts argue that it could take years, maybe even decades, before the necessary infrastructure is fully in place. Then there's the issue of qualified personnel. The southern region of Mexico, where the corridor is being built, historically has lower levels of industrial development compared to the northern part of the country. This means that even if the infrastructure is built, the region will need skilled workers to operate the logistics hubs, ports, and industrial parks. Without serious investment in education and workforce training, Mexico might struggle to attract the kind of industries it hopes will thrive in the corridor. Another massive hurdle is energy, specifically natural gas. The corridor requires an enormous amount of natural gas to power its industrial parks and manufacturing facilities. However, Mexico's current supply simply isn't enough to meet these demands. To put it into perspective, estimates suggest that the project will need an increase of over 120% in Mexico's national natural gas distribution. That's a staggering amount, especially considering that Mexico imports a large portion of its natural gas from the United States. The state-owned oil and gas company, Pemex, has been trying to ramp up domestic production, but progress has been slow. Mexico has already planned to build new pipelines and energy infrastructure, but these projects take time, money, and political will. Even if Mexico builds all the necessary infrastructure and solves its energy problems, one big question still remains: will global shipping companies actually use this route? At the moment, there's a lot of skepticism. The Financial Times reported in October 2023 that major international shipping companies and logistics firms haven't shown strong interest in the corridor yet. While some companies like Maersk have acknowledged its potential, many aren't convinced that it can compete with the convenience of the Panama Canal. One of the main issues is that the corridor can only transport a fraction of the cargo that moves through the Panama Canal. While projections estimate that 1.14 million containers could move through the corridor annually, the Panama Canal handled over 10.9 million containers in 2022 alone. That's a huge difference, and it raises doubts about whether the corridor can attract enough traffic to make economic sense. Shipping companies are also notoriously cautious about changing routes. When a new alternative appears, many prefer to stick with what they know unless they are absolutely sure the new option is reliable, cost-effective, and efficient. In other words, just because the corridor exists doesn't mean companies will use it. Mexico has to prove its worth. Then there's the issue of safety and crime. The southern part of Mexico has historically struggled with cartel activity and organized crime, and ensuring safe and uninterrupted cargo movement through the corridor is a major concern. Logistics companies and investors need certainty that their shipments won't be delayed or stolen and that infrastructure like railways, ports, and storage facilities won't be targeted by criminal organizations. While the Mexican government has placed the corridor under the control of the Navy to provide additional security, whether this will be enough to reassure global investors remains to be seen. At this point, you might be wondering what Elon Musk has to do with all of this. Elon Musk's terrifying prediction? Well, according to insiders, Elon Musk has recently revealed the terrifying truth behind Mexico's $4.5 billion Panama Canal rival, and it concerns the shocking reality that despite all its current challenges, it will soon replace the Panama Canal. Elon has always been known as a visionary when it comes to resource efficiency. Whether it's his push for sustainable energy with Tesla or his plans for colonizing Mars, Musk believes that humanity must learn to conserve resources on Earth if it ever hopes to survive in space. According to sources, he has recently conducted a detailed resource-based calculation proving that the Panama Canal is already inefficient compared to its past performance and that things will only get worse. While the numbers still favor the Panama Canal today, Elon predicts that this won't last for long. His analysis shows that the canal is declining at a much faster rate than previously thought, and each passing year will make it even less cost-effective to maintain. In other words, he thinks that Panama is over. He argues that the money spent keeping the canal operational would be better redirected toward Mexico's Interoceanic Corridor, which, once completed, will be far more efficient and sustainable. Most shockingly, Elon doesn't think this transition will take decades. He predicts that in less than 10 years, the Interoceanic Corridor will overtake the Panama Canal as the dominant trade route. His calculations suggest that the collapse of the Panama Canal's dominance is inevitable, and soon the world will have no choice but to switch to the more efficient Mexican rival. Do you think his prediction about the decline of the Panama Canal is accurate, or is he being overly dramatic? Let us know in the comments and subscribe to our channel for more.